Thank you and good morning. It's morning for me. I usually sleep till noon or 1, but I'm up early today. So let's see. Before I show the pictures, let me just say that I started out as a folk singer in a folk group way back in the early 60s. And that was at Hawaii. I was at the University of Hawaii, and I started singing in a coffee shop there, coffee house, called the Green Sleeves Coffee House. And we put a group together and came to LA to seek our fortunes. We were called the Modern Folk Quartet. And we recorded a bit on Warner Brothers and a couple other labels. And on our last tour across the country, doing college concerts, because folk music was huge in colleges in the 60s. And we would just go back and forth across the country playing colleges and folk clubs. But on our last tour, in the beginning of 1966, we stopped our little motorhome. We had a Clark Cortez motorhome, and we stopped at a little secondhand store in Michigan. And we all ran in to buy junk that we didn't need, but there was a big table full of used cameras, secondhand cameras. And someone in the group grabbed one and said, "Oh, a camera." And then I said, "Well, hey, I'll get one too." And we all never thought about having a camera or taking pictures, but so then the one guy in the group said, "Pull into the next drugstore and I'll buy film." So he ran in and handed us each a little yellow Kodak box. And then I said, "Well, what are these numbers on here? What is this and what is it?" He said, "Well, look on the box and it'll say, it'll tell you how to set it." So it said sunlight 250 at 8. So I said, "Oh, okay, here's 250, here's 8. We'll go out in the sunlight and shoot." So for 3 weeks, we took pictures of each other. And we got back to LA, got the film developed, and lo and behold, it was slide film. I had no idea about any kind of film, And I said, "Wow, look, they're little pictures, let's have a slideshow, and we'll invite all our friends." And when that first slide hit the wall, 8 feet wide, I just couldn't even believe it. I thought, this is the most magic thing I've ever seen. Now, mind you, in those days when you had a slideshow with a Kodak slide projector, and it would go click, and the next one would hit the wall, click, and then it was like, wow, it was just unbelievable. And in the digital age, it's much easier to carry them around and project them and all, but they don't look quite the same as they did with the old Kodak slide projector. But that first slideshow, I vowed, I've got to take more of these things so we can have more of these slideshows, because this is really fun. So I spent the next months photographing all my friends, the guys in the group, their girlfriends, and anything that I saw. I mean, old trucks, cats. I remember getting close-up rings and photographing snails on the ivy, and then you'd blow them up. They'd be 8-foot, snails. And I just was having so much fun with it. And some of my friends were David Crosby and Mama Cass and Stephen Stills, and these were all people that I kind of grew up in the folk music business with. We played the same clubs, and we would see each other in Laurel Canyon or at the Troubadour Club, or we'd cross paths on the road. I started photographing them, and pretty soon, people started using the pictures. Wow, we could use this for a magazine or for the back of an album or something. And so I kind of just made the transition from a singer to a photographer without really thinking about it. So today, I'm going to, this is a little different than the usual slideshows. Now, back in the old days, slides were only color. You couldn't project a black and white. But I'm going to start with black and whites, because I have this book here of black and white photos that we self-published at the Morrison Hotel. It's not in any stores or anything yet. So I'm going to start with some of these things, and then we'll get to the old-fashioned color slideshow. This was, well, I was shooting publicity pictures of James Taylor, and they only needed black and white because in those days you couldn't put a color picture in a newspaper. They had to be black and white. So when a group needed publicity pictures, that meant just black and white. So we were shooting these pictures at a friend of mine's place called The Farm, and James leaned on that post. He's a big, tall guy, and leaned on that post, and his blue work shirt and the sort of reddish background just looked so great that I said, "Wait a minute, James," and I got my color camera, took a couple shots thinking, I gotta have one of these for my slideshow, just to show my friends, So So I took a couple of color pictures, and the manager saw them and said, wow, these are great. We want to use one of these for the album cover. So it became the album cover for Sweet Baby James, kind of accidentally. But I always liked this black and white shot better. And I believe in the old 12-inch square album covers, this was an insert. It was a double album size inserted in the album. So also, Sweet Baby James became one of my favorite all-time songs, and I would sing it to both of my little children, you know, putting them to sleep, sing them Sweet Baby James. But of course, when I took the picture, I'd never heard the song yet, because you take these pictures before the album comes out usually. But I was very proud to have that cover. In the early 70s, I used to go up to Neil Young's ranch quite a bit and hang out, and just, it wasn't a job or an assignment, I was just kind of there as a friend, and I would, we'd walk around the farm and I'd just take a bunch of pictures, which later got used mostly in songbooks. They used to put songbooks out with lots of photos in them, until the publishers realized they didn't have to, if they didn't have those pictures, they wouldn't have to pay any photographer to use them. So nowadays you get a song book and there's no photos in it really. But this is Neil at his ranch in Northern California. Here he is driving his World War II Jeep across the cow fields, bumping along. This is Joni Mitchell and Graham Nash during the time when they lived together in Laurel Canyon, and Graham wrote that song, Our House is a Very, Very, Very Fine House. This was on a trip up to Big Bear. It was like a 3-hour drive in a limousine to take pictures of Crosby, Stills, Nash for the inside of their first album. And I was sitting in the jump seat, kind of facing them. After a couple hours, you know, they kind of forgot I was there, and it was easy to take these candid photos. They didn't even notice what I was doing. Here's Jim Morrison at the Hollywood Bowl. One of my very good friends, in fact, the guy who owned the house where I did my very first slideshow, named Ron Jacobs, was the program director for KHJ Radio, and he would always invite me to come to all the concerts. And once again, a lot of these they're not assignments, they're not jobs, it's just me kind of hanging out. And I knew Jim because I'd seen him play at the Whiskey, and our group played at the Whiskey A Go-Go as well. And he was a very quiet guy. People always say, what was Jim Morrison really like? And they've seen the movie and they think he was a big, you know, outgoing rock star, but really he was very quiet and very bemused is the word I use. He would have a little smile. He was very cool. Hey man, you know, he'd smile and nod, but he would never, he didn't come up and, you know, say, hey, guess what? You know, he was not outgoing at all. He was a very quiet, observant poet sort of a guy. This is Chris Christopherson up in Colorado. There was a big recording ranch up there called Caribou Ranch, where groups could come and spend a whole week, and their band could live in the cabins, and they had a horseback riding capabilities and a big recording studio, and everyone had a great time going there. There's one thing about being a photographer for these kinds of people, inevitably you're going to find yourself horseback riding. You know, it happens pretty often. And if you got a bag with, you know, 5 lenses and a couple of bodies, I mean, it's 30, 40 pounds of camera equipment, inevitably they're going to start galloping. And of course you got to keep up, and these things bang against your sides like that. You're galloping along. So there's Chris at Caribou, and that's his little daughter Casey that he's riding with. This would have been, I guess, sometime in the late 70s, maybe. That's Timothy Schmidt, who's in the Eagles, was in Poco. I call it Timothy Schmidt Rides the Bowsprit. That's Joe Walsh's sailboat, the So What. And we were with the Eagles sailing over to Santa Cruz Island to take some photos. Here is Keith Richards, not a Rolling Stones tour, but a group called the New Barbarians, which was Ron Wood's solo group. Ron Wood from the Rolling Stones made a solo album, and Columbia Records wanted him to tour for a month and publicize the album. So Ron had to put a group together, and he got Keith to play guitar. He got Stanley Clarke was a famous jazz bass player, and Ian McLagan was another English guy on the keyboards. He was in Small Faces, and they barnstormed around the country, and I was on the tour for 3 weeks. And so here's his new Barbarians backstage pass and this bottle of Jack Daniels. And they had a great big huge airplane, big passenger jet, and they would land on the other side of the airfield. They wouldn't have to go through the airport. And when they would land, about 8 limousines would come out and converge around the airplane. So they'd walk right down the steps and jump into their limos and take off for the hotel. So he's just found his limo, and he's standing there waiting for Ron Woody. So he's just standing there kind of waiting like this for Woody to come and get in the car with him. Here, this is the Doors. Again, publicity shots, black and white. The week before, we'd done the Morrison Hotel album cover, and then the manager said, well, we need publicity pictures, and these are all color, so could you spend the day doing black and white pictures? So we went out to the beach in Venice and walked around and took these pictures. It was in December, and they are under the Venice Pier, which isn't even there anymore. It got washed away in a storm years ago. And they're watching a surfer come in, and he's doing what they call shooting the piles, which is to surf around the big posts that hold the pier up. It's very dangerous. And of course, Densmore there in the white jacket is a surfer, so he's going, woo, gnarly. Yeah. Here's Paul and Linda McCartney and their 2 little daughters, Heather and Mary. Stella wasn't born yet. I met Linda at Modern Age the Photo Lab. I'm not sure if it's here anymore. Does anybody know? Is it?
Still here.
Well, I met her there in, I think, '66. And we became friends, and we had lunch a couple times in LA. And then I was surprised to see she married Paul McCartney. And so one day she called me and asked if I could come out to their house in Malibu because she needed pictures of the 2 of them they'd done an album called Ram, and she was on the album, and they needed photos for a songbook. So I spent the day around the swimming pool with them, and it was a wonderful time. There's another couple of pictures coming up later up from that day. Here's Tom Waits. He was writing the music for a Coppola film called One from the Heart. And so he was at the Zoetrope movie studios where they'd given him a little room, just slightly bigger than that grand piano. And he spent days and days in there composing music for this movie. And he had this paper strewn around the floor. Once again, it wasn't a photo assignment. A friend of mine was going to interview him, a guy named Stephen Peoples. He said, hey, I'm going to go interview Tom Waits this afternoon. You want to come along? I said, sure, because I knew Tom from around town. So I got to just hang out and take candid photos while they talked. There is Stephen Stills and Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers had a huge mansion out in Surrey in England. It was called Brookfield House. And he sold it to Ringo Starr, and Ringo Starr sold it to Stephen Stills. But we met Peter Sellers in a club one night in London, and Stephen said, hey, I'm living in your house, that you used to own. He said, I love that house. And Stephen invited him out for on the weekend to come and hang out. And the guy in the middle is John the gardener, who had been there all those years. I mean, if you buy the house, you get John the gardener as well. And he'd be out in his tweed jacket with his pipe planting crocuses and daffodils. And he would always say, when Mr. Sellers was here, we would have, this would happen, Spencer Tracy would be here, and all these things were going on. And Stephen wrote a song called In Johnny's Garden, which was about John the gardener. And they remember that movie, Being There, and Chauncey the gardener. Peter Sellers was really playing John the gardener. I mean, he was really, kind of imitating what he'd learned from John the gardener. Fantastic guy. He's probably still there. Somebody bought the house from Stephen, I think a Levi company owner or something. I'm sure John is still there. Here is the Monkees with Jack Nicholson. Jack Nicholson was the co-producer and co-writer of their movie Head, which they did after they stopped their weekly TV show. And so here they are in the dressing room in Salt Lake City, Utah, just before they went on stage to film for the movie Head. So Jack was there. They were all really good friends of mine. Well, I'll talk about that later, but I did have a job working on that TV set just about every day for a year and a half. And Mickey Dolenz right here was my neighbor up in Laurel Canyon. He lived just a little bit further down Lookout Mountain Avenue from me. Here is that same New Barbarians tour, and here's Keith and Woody. We were in a Learjet here, flying from LA to San Diego for the last concert. And you see the foot down there in Keith's lap. That's his 18-year-old Swedish model tour companion that he had with him. And so I'm sitting in the fourth seat. It's only a four-seater plane. And Ron's wife, Cynthia, was going to go. And the last minute, she decided not to go. So the road manager said, Henry, you jump in there with him. And all the rest of the band and everybody had to ride the bus for 3 hours, but we had a 45-minute Learjet ride. So I always say they were a captive audience for me, but really I was the captive audience for them because they were just joking and, you know, doing shtick the whole way down there. It was really fun. I wish I had a movie camera. Okay, so now we'll this is what a slideshow used to be like for me. And I would start, you know, before I ever had any rock stars, you know, I just had just pictures like this to entertain my friends. Usually it would be in the pitch dark. We've got a little light here, and it would be a little bit bigger. And but at any rate, this is going to Neil Young's house up in Northern California, and that would be Neil Young's driveway right there that went several miles back into the hills. And I just got out of the car and laid down on my stomach with an 18-millimeter lens to get that picture. Here's Neil Young's cow. And this was taken with a 500-millimeter lens, which really kind of compresses the whole thing. So, of course, all of these are film pictures. I now shoot digital. 5 years ago, I said, I will never shoot digital. I'm a film guy, you know, 50 years. But now I shoot digital. But of course, all of these are film things that I did back in the 60s and 70s. So nowadays, the job is just to scan all of the slides and all the negatives that I have. But this is one of my favorite. I love to shoot cows. Cows and trucks are fun to shoot because they sort of fill the frame. You know, they're rectangular if you get them from the right angle. And they're some of my favorite subjects. The manager of our singing group, Herbie Cohen, that's his wife Suzanne Cohen in the foreground, and her friend Terry designed these clothes. So we just drove up the coast from LA one spring to take some photos. That was like, this would have been '66, the first year that I was shooting. It was still 250 at 8 right from the film box, you know. This was a shot on Sunset Boulevard in LA long before we had cell phones, long before beepers. Maybe I had a beeper, but you have to stop at a payphone, you know. So I'd do errands in the afternoon and have to stop several times. So I pulled into this gas station, dialed the number, and then I just turned around, and that's what I saw. So I quickly picked up my camera. This is on the Hollywood freeway. This car was approaching from behind. Luckily, I wasn't driving because I probably would have crashed trying to take this picture. And I saw it in the rearview mirror, and he came up next to us. That dog's gums were flapping in the breeze. So now, it's a little bit small there, but when I was on the road on my first tour with a group was the Lovin Spoonful in '66. And that was because their producer had been my roommate in the folk days, Eric Jacobson. And he called me in California in '66. He said, Henry, you want to learn to be a photographer? Come on back to New York and spend the summer with the boys. They need tons of photos. We'll pay for all your film and processing, and then you'll learn how to be a photographer. So I said, great. So I did that. And every little city that we went to and across the Midwest, I would notice the fire hydrant was a different color. And this is actually a New York fire hydrant, I believe. Usually they're black and silver. But here in LA, they're all yellow. This is actually an orange one in LA. That was at Warner Brothers Studios, The Eyes of Laura Mars. They were starting to do that poster behind it. But so this is San Francisco where they're blue and white. So every little town had a different color, and I always would run out to the corner and take a picture of the fire hydrant. So this was my first, from all of my friends, I had categories or series of things. Fire hydrants was one of them. This is the usual New York fire hydrants. So all of these were done in the 60s pretty much. And now, 45 years later, I have hundreds of fire hydrants. I very seldom see a color I don't have. This is upstate New York. In 1976 was the bicentennial, and was it? Yeah, 1976. From 1776, right? The bicentennial. So people painted all over the place. They had these things painted like soldiers and things. This was in, gosh, I can't remember, somewhere in the Midwest. And on TV, I was on the road with John Stewart, a folk singer, and we saw on TV that the Electroplaters Union had dedicated this fire hydrant to the city. It might have been Cleveland or something. And I looked out the window, and there was a crowd of people around this fire hydrant. They said, "Look, it's right there." So the next morning, as we were leaving, I jumped out and took this picture of an electroplated fire hydrant. Here's one in Washington, D.C. So as I started taking all these pictures to entertain my friends, categories would inevitably come up. Actually, the first categories were all of my, if I took hundreds of pictures of my friends all week, inevitably there'd be 4 or 5 of them eating, shoving a hot dog in their mouth or something. And then there'd be some of people sleeping, some of people reading. So I had the reading series, the sleeping series, the eating series, just among my close personal friends. And then I branched out and started collecting things like fire hydrants was the first big one, and stars was one. This was over in India last year. So anywhere I go in the world or the country, I'm searching and hunting for about 50 categories of things. There's hearts and stars, T-shirts, tattoos, people giving the peace sign, people giving the finger, which you get a lot in rock and roll, mostly from David Crosby, and barns and old trucks and, the usual things like flowers and babies and animals, but they're things I hunt for. So these are all stars. And when I did these slideshows with my friends, remember, it was in the 60s, we were all hippies and we were smoking it, and so they would sit there and I would show a whole roller of stars. It would be 80 of them, and then they'd say, more, more, and then I'd show another thing, more, more. We'd just go all night looking at pictures. That belt buckle there. Yeah, I love this one. I really like stars, and that's a real tattoo on that guy there. It was a singing group, and I said, wait a minute, let me zero in on your hand there. That's me in the Bahamas, and back in the, I think it was 68. This is one of my favorites. This is on Hollywood Boulevard, where they have stars drawn, in the crosswalks. And right in the middle of the street, they had the yellow line going through this star. I always loved that. As I'm looking at this, I'm realizing most of these are from the late 60s. Yeah, this was late 60s. This was on the wall of the Gazzari's Club on Sunset Boulevard, the honor roll of musicians. Then hearts was another series that I would look for, all the various places you can find hearts. And so as you travel around, you look for all these things, and then after months and years, when you assemble them all, you say, wow, there's really a lot of these. And toilets was another favorite. There's my little daughter drinking from a cup with a star on it. Once on the road with the Lovin Spoonful, Zalyanovsky, their lead guitar player, knocked on my door of the motel. I opened it, he came waltzing into the room and he squirted lighter fluid all over on the mirror in the motel room and threw a match on it. It went boom, and flames shot up, and it just burns the liquid off the mirror. It doesn't really start a fire. And then he ran in the bathroom and squirted some in the toilet. It threw a match in, and I flushed the toilet, and the flames shot up, and I just got a picture of that. So I had the flaming toilet. So that was my first toilet picture. Then once at a party, I went into the bathroom, and in the toilet was one square of toilet paper floating there with a lipstick imprint, red lips on it, just floating. It just was so, I don't know what it stood for, but sort of like goodbye or something. So you find, throughout your life, you'll find some interesting toilet shots as you go along. Here was one right on Fifth Avenue. Don't know who that guy was, eating a sausage there with a bag on his head. And then American Flags is another series that I've hunted for all my life, and I have hundreds and hundreds of hearts. This one had a heart and a flag. So when I could get two categories in one thing, that would be the transition. I would go from hearts to flags, that way. Here's Jackson 5's drums with the hearts on them. I should say at this point, I used Nikon cameras back then, and I learned to use a spot meter. I had a Minolta spot meter, and I never used the meter in the camera, but I had this external spot meter, which I would take a reading like on somebody's face, and it would just be perfect. But nowadays, I graduated to digital, and I take almost everything on this little camera. I mean, if it's a concert, I have a big Canon that I use, but I take hundreds of pictures a day with this. So nowadays, all the stars and fire hydrants and hearts I take with this little camera. But none of these are from this camera. That was LA in the 60s again. So then this was Flags. That was up in Marin County, up northern California. An old 50s car of some kind. There's David Cassidy with an American flag. This is on an aircraft carrier. The opportunities are limitless for flag pictures. Here's Richard Pryor. We were shooting in my friend's garage, and we had that flag up for another picture that we'd taken a few days before. The watermelon was for lunch, actually, and he came in and he was kind of like Robin Williams, he just does a joke every second. He just doesn't stop, and you just keep clicking away. But that was a fun day. So here's another flag. That's from the 60s, Or maybe, I don't know, maybe it was back, when was the hostage thing? Was that so it might have been 70s, this one, yeah. So Mickey Mouse's, so that's a transition slide there between Flags and Mickey Mouse's. Mickey Mouse's is another category that I've collected all my life. And you find those all over the place. The trick for me, to entertain my friends was to get these things in odd situations. It couldn't just be a Mickey Mouse. It would have to be something going on usually. This was peace signs. And this was a Navajo girl out in the Four Corners area. And she was actually the first peace sign I took. And here's Ringo, of course. Almost every picture he's doing that. And that would be a transition between peace signs and stars, in the old days. This was in the 90s. So this is my first real music picture, real rock and roll picture. One day up in Laurel Canyon in '66, when I just gotten my camera, I heard guitar music coming out of one of the houses, and I walked up to the door, and Stephen Stills was in there, and he was an old friend of mine. I'd known him for, I guess I met him in '63 in New York City, long before Crosby, Stills, Nash, long before the Buffalo Springfield, which is this group. So I said, hey, Stephen, how you doing? He said, hey, we're going to the beach this afternoon, the Buffalo Springfield, to do a sound check. You want to come along? And I thought, yeah, I want to come along so I can walk on the beach and take photos for my slideshows. It was before I ever thought of being a music photographer. So while they were in the club doing the sound check, I was out on the beach shooting people. In fact, I got a picture of a guy with a monkey on his shoulder, and the monkey and the guy had the same little crew cut and beard, and it was one of my favorite shots. So I walked back to the folk club, and I was just photographing that big mural, thinking this will be good in the slideshow, and out the back door comes the Buffalo Springfield. And I said, hey, you guys, just stand there a minute in front of that big mural, because I wanted to show the scope of the mural. And so they stood there and I took a few shots, and a week later, a magazine called me, Teen Set magazine, and they said, we hear you have a picture of the Buffalo Springfield and we'd like to run it and we'll pay you $100. And I went, wow, what? I couldn't believe that somebody was going to pay me for a picture that I took, because I'd been spending all my musician money on film and processing. And so that was, wow. That was the second epiphany. The first epiphany was the first slideshow when that first slide hit the wall. The second epiphany was when somebody offered me money for one of these pictures. And so then I went to New York City and spent the summer with the Lovin' Spoonful. There they are. That's Zalyanovsky on the left, the guy who lit my toilet on fire. And the Spoonful, even though I was working for them for the whole summer, taking pictures, every time there'd be an opportunity for a group shot, which was what they really needed, they would think, being rock and rollers, they had to be like naughty boys, you know, they had to give me the finger or do something, stick their tongue out, anything to ruin the group shot. It was a little game we had, you know, so this is an example of them, you know, trying to goof up the shot. So we used it just like that on the back of one of their albums. And here are the Monkees on their TV set. One day, out of the blue, Tiger Beat magazine called me in '67, I guess, when I just got back from New York with the Lovin' Spoonful, and they said, would you go down to the sound stage where they're filming the Monkee show and spend the day, and we'll pay you for the day, and then you give us all the film. And they particularly wanted close-up headshots for magazine covers and posters. And so I'd go down in the morning, and each week would be, of course, a different episode. This was called Here a Chic, There a Chic. And you'd go in there Monday morning and some crazy situation would be set up, and that would be the show for the week. So this was early one morning I walked in, and that's what I saw. There was about 20 dancing girls, and the whole week would be fantastic just hanging out with those guys. It wasn't really a job, you know. They paid me $300 a day, and I wasn't married, didn't have any kids, so that was like a lot of money for me. And it was a lot of fun to hang out with these guys. Then I went on the whole summer tour with them in '67. Same thing with David Cassidy. Some years later, Tiger Beat called me again and said, would you go down to the Partridge Family TV soundstage and film for the day? So I walked on the set. I'd never met David before. He came up, I introduced myself, and we were talking, and I told him that I'd just come back from spending 4 months in England with Stephen Stills. And he said, really? Wow. He said, look, in the next break, come to my trailer, and I got my guitar, and I'll play you some songs. He was a frustrated rocker. He really wanted to be a rock and roll musician. He didn't want to be Keith Partridge anymore. So this is a funny story about this picture. I used to go to the Eagles' house, Don Henley and Glenn Frey, and they would be watching a sports event on TV, and they'd see the UCLA cheerleaders, and they had this funny thing. They would say, call Irving and have him send a limo for the cheerleaders. You know, it was just their macho thing. Nobody ever sent a limo for the cheerleaders, but I told that story to David Cassidy, and about a week later, a German magazine said, we'd like to do a home story on David. Would you ask him if he has any ideas? And he said, yeah, sure I do. Tell him to send a limo for the UCLA cheerleaders. And it was fine. They sent it. They were more than happy to come up. And they brought these outfits with them, and that wasn't planned, the football outfit and all that. So we spent the day. That's David's house in the valley in Encino. He had an orange grove in his backyard. And then David got to be really good friends with the girl on the right there. Her name was Delight de Bruyne. And they got to be really good friends. And so years later, this picture's hanging on our wall down in Soho at the Morrison Hotel Gallery. I wasn't there, but they told me some guy walks in, rushes over to that picture and says, "Oh, that's my wife on the right there." So don't know if he ever heard the story, but here's a very early rock and roll picture at the Renaissance Fair, David Crosby and the Byrds. This was an example of just, he's just a friend of mine, very much a fellow folk singer. I remember meeting him, gosh, he was in Lex Baxter's Balladeers or something. I think I met him in '63 or '4 in Florida when we were playing the same club or something. Mama Cass Elliott, who was, we call her the Gertrude Stein of Laurel Canyon, because she was a social catalyst. She was an amazing lady. First of all, she was an earth mother, and she wanted to make sure everybody was happy and comfortable and well fed. But she was three things that I always say, three things combined. She was extremely intelligent, extremely funny, and extremely hip. Two of those wouldn't have been all three. I mean, she was funny, but she was very hip at the same time. And she was just a load of fun to be with. And so we took, my partner Gary Burden was a graphic artist, and we collaborated on album covers. And we took this out in the desert in Palm Springs. I remember that's an oud right there. I played the 5-string banjo, always wanted an oud. And my father, who was in the State Department, was going to Egypt. And I said, "Dad, would you please buy me an oud?" So he bought me this oud, but he bought it in the airport, and it was a designer oud. You couldn't tune it up, it would break if you tuned it up. So, but we finally got to use it for something in this picture. This is another one of my neighbors in Laurel Canyon, Joni Mitchell, lived right down the street. And so Gary Burden and I went by there one day to take pictures. That's Gary Burden's little daughter, Amy, right there. Of course, what would she be now, 40, 45 years old or something? 40, I guess. And so Joni's playing her mountain dulcimer in the field behind her house. There was a bass player named Lee Sklar. There is a bass player named Lee Sklar in LA who's played on everybody, played with James Taylor, Jackson Browne, sort of everybody, Joni Mitchell. And every year he'd have a Halloween party, he and his wife, and invite all their musician friends. So my wife, Elizabeth, on the left, she and I went to this party, and there was this guy hanging around in the corners, just kind of not talking to anybody, and nobody knew who he was. And Lee came up to me and said, did you invite that guy? I said, "No, I never saw him before." Walking around asking everybody, nobody knew who it was. And so finally he went up and said, "Are you sure you're at the right party, mister?" And it was Joni Mitchell. Oh, wow. And it was dark in the party. This is a flash picture, so that makes it very bright. He was lurking way back in the back. I was really photographing my wife, and then that was in the picture as well. Yeah, she dressed up like this. It was her first time wearing this outfit. She was a pimp, and she called herself Art Nouveau. I think, yes, Art Nouveau. Later, she used this on an album cover, but none of her friends, these were her friends, people who played on her albums, and they did not recognize her. And then here's Joni without her disguise. I love that picture. That's leaning out the window of the very, very, very fine house in Laurel Canyon. Lovely, lovely lady, very, very talented lady. This is what it's like to be in the front row at a big concert in a stadium. You're kind of looking up the nose of the person. So this was a shot of Tina Turner. This one, Capitol Records had hired me to shoot the concert. And in those days, you had transparencies. There were no negatives, no copies. It was before scanning. There was never time to make slide dupes. They were never so good anyway. You had to give them the pictures the next day. So you'd have to give them all these slides, and you knew you'd never see them again. So you try to keep a couple of them back, you know. And I kept this one because I thought, well, they're never going to use this. She looks way too funky. And so I kept that. And a few years ago, a curator from the Boston Museum of Art came, and they were doing a show called Who Shot Rock, which is now touring the country. And she saw that picture and said, oh my God, so this became the cover of the book. It was billboards, it was on the sides of buses, and I said, oh my God, Tina Turner is just gonna kill me when she sees that. But she liked it. I thought it really was, said rock and roll. Here's Truman Capote. A lot later on, when I got established, a lot of jobs would start with a phone call in my kitchen in Laurel Canyon. A phone rang, Rolling Stone in New York, or maybe San Francisco. I don't remember where they were at that point, but they'd say, what are you doing today? And I said, well, nothing, sitting here. Could you get on a plane right now and fly to Palm Springs, go to Truman Capote's house, and take a photo for the cover, because we have a whole story but no cover photo. So I went and I thought, wow, Truman Capote, I studied his short stories in college, and I knew who he was. I thought, boy, so I always say being a photographer is like having a passport into people's lives where why would I be at Truman Capote's house? Knocked on the door, he was very gracious. We spent an hour out in the garden taking pictures and talking. He was telling me about his friend Dick Avedon, photographing him in the cornfields. So I took a lot of pictures of him leaning against statues and things in the garden. As I was leaving, he said, wait a minute, I have an idea. And he ran in his room and came out with this big coat and scarf and hat. It was probably 108 degrees outside in Palm Springs. And I was standing outside the front door just saying goodbye to him. And he comes running up in this. And I took a few shots, and then that was the cover of Rolling Stone right there. Of course, when you do these shoots, usually it's the last roll that has the picture. Very often it's the last few pictures you take because, the person's warmed up and they relax, and I'm warmed up, and usually you get the best shots right at the end. When that movie came out recently about Truman Capote, I saw an ad, and it was that actor, what was his name, who played Truman Capote? But they had him dressed up like this with the scarf and the hat. I said, wow, that's my picture. This is Bangladesh. The first big rock and roll charity was the concert for Bangladesh that George Harrison put together. And my friend Chip Monk was doing the lighting there, and he told me, he said, Henry, you should come to this big concert we're having. It's gonna, it's gonna be a really big event. I said, well, Chip, I'd love to, but I don't know the Beatles. I don't know those people. I couldn't get a photo pass. And he said, well, I'll tell you, come in the afternoon. I'll give you a crew pass, and you could hide your cameras under my lighting board, which is what I did. And I saw all day long, Alan Klein was kicking people out who had anyone with a camera. He would say, who's that guy? Get him out of here. Kick him out, everybody. And I'm walking around thinking, oh my God, don't notice me. So I hid my cameras under the lighting board, and when Bob Dylan came out on stage, I pulled him out and took a few pictures of the two of them. Here's Paul and Linda. This was that day where she called me to come out to Malibu. So we spent the whole day around the pool. It was really cool. Paul was sitting on the pool chair playing his ukulele. And as the little girls held hands and they jumped in the swimming pool, and he sang a little song, Two Little Sisters Jumping in the Pool. And I thought, wow. I mean, a beautiful melody, and it just went up into the air. I said, wow, that's how he writes those songs. He just sits there plunking on his instrument. So I knew when that song came out, who's that knocking at the door? I knew he'd been sitting on the couch with his feet on the coffee table, and somebody knocked on the door, and he probably just said, who's that knocking at the door? Made the whole thing up like that. So after I took these pictures, Linda said, we need to see these first thing in the morning because we need to pick out a cover for Life magazine. I went, my God, are you kidding me? That was the holy grail, of photographers just to be in Life magazine. So I went back the next morning, I got them developed overnight, and they went through them all, picked out this picture for the cover of Life. Now, the Life magazine lady was sitting in the living room waiting. Of course, we had no scanning and emailing. We had no fax machines. We didn't even have FedEx in those days. And it was 71. I don't think FedEx was around. At least I didn't know about it. So she had to sit in the living room and wait to take that one slide, get in the car, drive to the airport, and fly to New York with it to put it on the cover. And there wasn't time to print it in color, so it was in black and white. But so this was my one accidental Life magazine cover. Then here's Paul and I and Linda at their house, and the little kids in the back. I always tried to take one sort of self-portrait, you know. Here's Crosby, Stills, Nash. That picture of Joni and Graham in the limo was for this day, where we had to drive 3 hours up into the mountains to get the snow so they could wear these fur coats and take pictures in the snow for the inside of their first album. This is, well, how did this story start? It started, Stephen called me one day and said, I broke my hand. I crashed my Ferrari in England and broke my hand. He said, I've got to go somewhere to heal it up. So he said, you remember that disc jockey in Hawaii who had a beach house? Could you call him and see if I could go stay for a couple weeks at his beach house? And then he said, you want to come along? So I went. We spent a few weeks in Hawaii. Then he said, I'm going to Colorado now for a week if you want to come along. And I came along to Colorado. And so the night Jimi Hendrix died, he got the phone call and stayed up all night sitting and playing the piano. And in the morning, there was snow outside. The day before, there hadn't been any snow. So this was like, 5:30, 6 in the morning. He said, grab your cameras. And he went out there. I took a few shots of him, and he said, wait a minute. And he ran back in the house and came out with this pink giraffe and sat it in the snow, And I took a few shots, and then I said, okay, Stephen, we're through with the giraffe now. I wanted to get that thing out of there, and because I thought it was kind of ruining these beautiful shots. And he said, no, I want this giraffe in the pictures. So once again, it wasn't for anything in particular. We were just taking pictures. And then later that year, this got picked out for his first solo album cover. But now, I can't do it here in a slideshow. Usually, I cover up that giraffe, and I say, without the giraffe, it's kind of boring, So now I've learned to love the giraffe. There's Neil Young at his ranch, one of those morning walks around his ranch. He bought this whole valley, and it had quite a number of barns. And he's like, one barn now is full of old cars. Another barn has his Lionel train set in it, and Lionel train set's as big as this room. And another barn is a recording studio. So he's made good use of all the barns on his land. By the way, you should read his autobiography that's out now. Waging Heavy Peace, it's called. It's a fantastic book that he wrote all himself, and it's like he's sitting there talking to you. It's if you're a fan of Neil, and even if you aren't, you should get his book and read it. These are the Turtles on the road. So Mark Volman, second from the left with all the hair, was my neighbor in Laurel Canyon, lived across the street, and a very, very good friend of mine. They invited me to go on a weekend in the Midwest. So we were driving around in a station wagon, and we saw these signs that said cheese, and they were with an arrow. And we're driving, thinking, what the heck? We started following these arrows with cheese, and then we came to a place called the Bass Lake Cheese Factory. And we went in, and they're eating cheese on sticks there. It's not ice cream bars, it's cheese. And we got back in the car, and we saw that sign and just had to stop. I wanted to stop just to take the sign, and then they all wanted a picture with the sign. Now, when I was in high school, I went to high school with lots of Army brats, and there was one girl whose father was a brigadier general, and she was my girlfriend for a while, and he had a saying, that's PPP, poor prior planning. It was a military thing, and so I saw that sign, I thought, that's PPP right there, right? Here's the group America out in the desert in Southern California. We rode horseback for 2 hours out to an oasis with a little pond right through the desert. There was a pond and palm trees. And we were riding on the horses, and I kept thinking, wow, here, horse with no name, you know, been through the desert on a horse. And here I was riding with in a desert. So my friend Gary wanted him to bring that mirror out. It was a great big mirror. He wanted actually to lay it on the ground, and the group would look into it, and then I would take the picture. It would look like they were looking in a hole, or I was looking out of a hole or something. But the night before, the guy in the front, Dewey, loves animals, and there was bats flying around. He said, I'm going to run up the hill there and look at those bats. And so Gary said, well, why don't you all go up there and carry that mirror with you? And I thought, well, what's that for? And so they got up there. It was quite a ways away. And I think it's a 300 millimeter lens. And as they walked along carrying the mirror, I saw this light bouncing up and down. They said, wait a minute, stop, you guys. And they stopped, and it was the moon coming up on the other side. And so, I mean, it looks like something we planned very carefully, but it was totally by accident. So the moon was coming up behind us. We couldn't see it. We were down in the valley, and only on top of the mountain could you see the moon, and the sun is setting on the other side. So that became the back of one of their albums. Here's John Sebastian from the Lovin' Spoonful. When he left the Lovin' Spoonful, he moved out to California, and he lived on my friend's place called The Farm, where I shot the Sweet Baby James cover. And there was a lady there named Tie-Dye Annie, and she taught him how to tie-dye, and he tie-dyed every single piece of clothing, and his sheets, pillowcase, the tent he lived in. And here's his clothesline. The Eagles, we did their first album cover out in Joshua Tree, and then the second album cover was this cowboy, Desperado. So we got them all dressed up like cowboys, and they had a big shootout out at this old derelict movie ranch, like a ghost town out in the hills. And they had real guns with blank ammunition. And it was like a throwback, you know, to 100 years or 200 years previous. And then we had a book of actual outlaw photos, and it showed the Dalton brothers laying dead in the street. And the posse would always pose with these dead bodies like this, proudly. And the guy on the left is Gary Burden, my graphic artist partner, the guy with the rifle. The guy on the right with the white hat is Glyn Johns, the English producer, whom I saw in the street in Soho 2 days ago. He just was walking across the street. I said, Glyn, I said, I'm always talking about you in these slideshows. And then the rest of the guys are the posse. I mean, the rest of the guys being the posse are the roadies and guys. And John Hartman with the brocaded vest there was their manager. Here's Jackson Browne. We were trying out some ideas for Late for the Sky. This wasn't the album cover at all. But we tried this. Now, Glenn Fry from the Eagles had bought Jackson a 55 Chevy and gave it to him as a present to celebrate they recorded that song, Old 55, that Tom Waits wrote. And Jackson was a fellow songwriter. And I don't know, he just bought it for him. Jackson gave it to a girlfriend. And so here we are a couple years later, and we had to borrow the car, and that's the girlfriend waiting in the back seat with her feet up. That was another accident. She just was sitting back there waiting till we were through with her car so she could drive home. Here's Garth Brooks. In later years, he was a recording artist for Capitol Records, and I showed him a book, kind of like this black and white book, and he's looking through. He said, well, Henry, you took these pictures of James Taylor and Dan Fogelberg? Why, these are my heroes. This is why I write music and sing. And so after that, I would get calls all the time. Garth wants you to go out on the road with him. Garth wants you to go to Ireland with him. Garth, and so I became Garth's photographer. Heck of a nice guy. He'll be, he was the top of all the charts some years ago. And then he kind of quit at the top because his daughters were going into high school, and he wanted to be there for them. He's such a good dad. And he said, as soon as the last daughter graduates, I'm going to go out again. So that's going to be in a year or two. He's going to go out and do it all over again. This was at a video at a movie theater downtown LA. So here's the old Morrison Hotel album cover. We got a phone call from the Doors, and they wanted us to do their cover. And so we went over to their office and had a meeting, and we said, well, do you have a title? They said, no. I said, well, do you have some ideas? What do you want to do? Well, we don't know. We don't have any ideas. And then then at that moment, Ray Manzarek on the left, the keyboard player, said, well, you know, my wife Dorothy and I were driving through downtown LA the other day, and we saw this old hotel that said Morrison Hotel on the window. And we said, wow, that sounds great. We went right down and saw it. It looked great. So we came back a few days later with the group, and we walk in the lobby. It's a place, a flop house. You know what I mean? Rooms $2.50. Nowadays, of course, it would be $250, but $2.50, and it was for winos to sleep it off, you know. And so we walk in the lobby, and we tell the guy at the desk, I said, well, we're just going to take some photos over there. Nobody was in the lobby. He said, oh no, you can't shoot any photos in here. I said, well, why not? You know, he said, well, the owner, you've got to talk to the owner. It was like a slumlord who owned it, who was, you know, very particular. And so I said, well, heck, you know what? Come on, guys, we have to walk outside, and maybe I could get them to stand, you know, they could stand in front of the window, because then they couldn't stop us. It would be on the sidewalk. And so we walked out, and we were going to do that, and I just noticed this light come on right up here. And I said, what the heck is that? I looked in the window, and it was the elevator. The guy had left the desk and got in the elevator. So nobody was in there, and I said, quick, you know, run in there, you guys, and just get behind that mirror, that window, and we'll just bang, bang, bang. We took one roll of film, and then we got out of there. And I always love it when there's a guest person in the album cover, you know. Then Jim said, let's go get a drink. So we got in the Volkswagen van, and we drove a few blocks to Skid Row, where it was all bars and pawn shops. We didn't know where to stop until somebody said, look, on the corner, Hard Rock Cafe. Okay, we'll get our beer there. So we went in there and spent about an hour. Jim loved to hear these old guys in there telling their stories, you know, about their lives. And here we are inside the bar. And some girl called our gallery the other day and said her father is in one of these pictures here, which was very strange to hear. The other thing is, this came out on the back of the Morrison Hotel, the shot of just the Hard Rock. And as soon as the album came out, they got a call from London. And a voice on the phone said, do you mind if we use that name? We're starting a cafe here in London. We'd like to call it the Hard Rock Cafe. They said, no, go right ahead. And that was the beginning of the whole, you know, Hard Rocks in every city in the world. And a guy told me recently that when he was a little boy in the 30s, he used to walk by this place, and it was there in the 30s called the Hard Rock Cafe. So it didn't mean music at all. It meant mining or rock in a hard place or something. So here they are in the bar, and then here's Jim with all of his best new friends. You know, he would buy these guys a beer, and then he wanted to listen to their stories. I told you he was a good listener. He was very poetic, and he wanted to hear what these guys were saying about their lives. He found it fascinating. And they thought he was a great guy. You know, they had no idea who the Doors were, who he was. I mean, he wasn't even that famous yet at that point. But they thought he was a great guy. So this is on the road with the new Barbarians again. I'll tell you, it was great to see all those concerts with Keith playing the guitar. He really is an amazing guitar player. The first sound check that I went into, I mean, I'd been to a couple of Rolling Stones concerts, but you know, the first concert, he was doing the sound check, and he played, nobody was in the place, and he played one chord, and it just filled the place with the sound. And I went, wow, that one chord just said, that is the Rolling Stones. I mean, just the warmth and the, you know, it was loud as hell, but it was kind of like when you hear a bass drum in a marching band, it just hits you, and it was such a beautiful, warm sound. And I thought, that guy is the Rolling Stones right there. The whole sound. So afterwards, okay, the story here is that halfway through the concert, they had a tuning tent, they called it, on the back of the stage. It was a tent they could go into, and sitting on a table would be these great big downer pills, great big old horse capsules that were downers. And they would all take one, so that by the time the encore came, you know, they were falling down. They were like rubber legs holding each other up, and the crowd would go crazy because they'd given their last ounce of energy, you know, for rock and roll. And honest to God. And so by the time they get back to the dressing room, they'd absolutely fall on the floor. Half the time, Keith would go to sleep for like 45 minutes or an hour, and that would be all the sleep he got for 24 hours. Honest to God, they would go back to the hotel, party all night, and the next afternoon they'd be off to the next gig, and they hadn't slept at all. So that's all he needed, was that good hour's sleep, you know. This was a Nirvana concert. My daughter wanted to go see Nirvana, and I didn't know the group or anything. I'd never met them, but I knew the management company, so they sent me a couple tickets, and they put a photo pass in there. Well, my wife said, okay, you can take Zoe with, you know, Zoe to see the concert. She was 13, but she said, but do not leave her out of sight for a moment. So we're sitting way in the back of the whole, you know, forum arena, and I had my binoculars, and I could see the front of the stage. All of my fellow photographers were all there photographing, and I thought, I should be down there. I had my camera with me, and I said, Zoe, honey, just sit right here and don't move, you know. And I went down there. It took me the whole second song to get there, and so I had one song left. You could only shoot 3 songs. So the third number, I'm shooting, and he's just standing there at the mic, and the light's kind of yellow, and it doesn't look like anything. And I thought, shoot, you know, I made all this trouble to get down here, and nothing at all is happening. And at the very end of the number, he turned around and threw his head back like that, and I took the picture, and I thought, well, it's going to be blurry because it was low light. I was at a 15th of a second or something. It shouldn't have come out that way, but it did. When of course, in those days, you couldn't look right away. You had to wait a few days till you got it developed. And I thought, wow, look at that one shot on the roll, the last shot. And it was like some kind of a gift, you know, from God or something. So I really loved that shot. Now this is Woodstock. I'm going to end with stuff here at Woodstock. That same old friend of mine, Chip Monk, called me. This was before the Bangladesh concert. He called. He said, Henry, you should come out to New York. We're going to have a huge concert out here and this summer. And I said, boy, I've heard about it, but I don't know any of those people. How am I going to get a photo pass? He said, well, let me talk to the producer. And the next day, Michael Lang called me, and he said, Chip says we need you out here, so I'm going to send you a ticket, and you know, $500, and you come out and photograph everything. That was 2 weeks before Woodstock, so it was like summer camp. They were building that huge deck, you know, in the middle of this green alfalfa field, and it was like an aircraft carrier, and all these hippie carpenters with their shirts off, all suntan, long hair, sawing and hammering, building this thing, and the girls would come in the afternoon with sandwiches and drinks, and it was just like summer camp. All this work going on. So I spent a great deal of time right up there on that deck. And then one day, there was about 20 people sitting out on the hillside. I thought, for a moment, I thought, what are those people doing there? Oh yeah, right, it's going to be a concert. I forgot it. And then the next day there were 2,000 people, and the next day 400,000 people. So here's John Sebastian in his tie-dyes. John Sebastian wasn't even on the bill. He lived in the town of Woodstock, and he came over for the afternoon to see the show, and he was tripping on some acid that he had taken, and he was high as a kite, and they handed him a guitar. They couldn't get the next act in quick enough because all the roads were blocked, so they had to use helicopters. So there was a break in the show, and all those people standing there, they said, John, go out there, here's a guitar. And he went out and did the best show of his life. It was fantastic. Yeah, it was so great. He was talking to that crowd like it was just his best friend, you know. It was really, really fun. So that crowd, see, it goes way off to, you know, to the horizon. but it also went all the way to the left, all the way to the right. I mean, that's a little part of the middle, but it was 180 degrees of that many people. It was quite amazing. I spent most of my time on the stage or in front of the stage, but I did go out a little bit out to the hog farm, and it was kind of hard to get around. A lot of groups would come and spend the afternoon sitting at the edge of the stage. This was the Jefferson Airplane, and there's Bill Graham kneeling down on the right. One day a couple of years ago, I got a call from a kid somewhere in the Midwest. He said, "You have a picture of my mom at Woodstock. She's wearing red glasses and she's sitting with the Jefferson Airplane." And I said, "Yeah, I know that picture," because I didn't know who that was. He said he wanted to give it to her for her birthday, so we got him a print made. But that's Grace Slick right there, and Paul Kantner on the left. So here's Grace Slick and a girl named Sally Mann. Sally Mann was married to the drummer Spencer. Yeah, Spencer Dryden. Is that it? Yeah. And Sally had been, when my group was playing the Trip in 63 or 64, I think 63 in LA, she was like a little teenage sort of, what they called a groupie. And she would come around to see us play, this real young girl, and then she ended up here married to the drummer. And then I lost track of her for all these years since Woodstock. About 2 years ago, she contacted me on Facebook. So she's now a lawyer somewhere in Texas. You could find her on Facebook, Sally Mann, M-A-N-N, yeah. Here's the Jefferson Airplane. They were playing just at dawn one morning. They went on in the dark, and then as it got light, they were playing. So that was a good vantage point there, right on stage. Now this is, I also shot Woodstock 94 and Woodstock 99. This is Woodstock 99, which featured crowd surfing. We didn't have that in 69, but in 99 we had that. And of course the mud people, it rained every Woodstock, and the people would slide in the mud and get full of mud. They call them the mud people. I had another shot, my normal last shot, which I call the end, is David Cassidy at the beach, doing a BA, but we couldn't show that either. So that is the end of the slideshow. So thank you very much. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes?
I have two questions, if that's
possible. Sure.
Since Herbie Cohen was your manager, I'm surprised you don't have a million photos of Zappa and the Mothers from the 60s.
I did. I think there's a couple photos in the book of Zappa. I did shoot some. He was my neighbor in Laurel Canyon as well. But I don't know. I was always busy with Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Joni Mitchell. I was kind of in the folk crowd, and Zappa was something totally different. I mean, I did know him and see him around, but I did shoot a couple of things. One afternoon, I did a rehearsal.
And then the other question: did you ever study or ever think of your compositions are so brilliant? I'm wondering how was it always innate, or did you ever think about compositions or study?
I'm supposed to say what the question is, right? The first question was about Zappa, why I didn't shoot pictures of Zappa. The second question is, you're asking about my composition.
And if you ever studied formally.
Did I study formally? No, I never did. As I said, my school of photography was the little Kodak box, that said 250/8. But no, I mean, I took art in high school. I mean, I think maybe it was just something that was, I think framing is the most fun, Framing is what, so there'd be framing, there'd be the moment that you pick, and there'd be the technical part of setting the camera right. I just wanted to, every time I saw something, I wanted it to look exactly the way I saw it for my slideshows, for my friends, I wanted it to be just the way it looked. So I would take a reading with the spot meter, and then set the camera. That was the technical part, and then framing was the main thing. And I never used a zoom lens because the f-stops were too high. You couldn't get a 1.8. It would be a 3.5 or something. So you couldn't get enough light in for low light. So I had about 5 lenses from wide angle all the way up to telephoto. So half of the fun was to pick the lens, you know. Well, do you want a 35? Do you want an 85? Do you want a 135? Do you want a 2? And then you would just move in and out a foot or two. It wasn't like you could stand there and go like this. And so that was the whole fun to me, was looking through that little window and just when it looked just the right way, push the button, you know. And I would always think of it as a picture on the wall, as a slide. I just wanted to make it, you know, look the juiciest way I could for a slide. So, you know, in this particular shot, I started shooting right up close to the window because they ran in there and I was taken from the side. And then Gary, my partner, said, no, back up, back up. He always said 2 things to me. One was always back up, back up. And I want the whole window, you know. And then he would say, the other thing he would say was, just keep shooting. Film's the cheapest part. So he just wanted me to shoot everything that happened. And, you know, strangely, I don't have the picture of Crosby, Stills, Nash on the couch. I don't know why that isn't in here, but that was one of our famous album covers. Same thing. He said, back up, get the whole house, you know. So framing was just an innate thing to me, you know, just to where it really looked right, you know. And then the other thing would be the moment. And usually when I'm shooting people, I'm shooting candid. I don't like, I mean, sometimes they have to pose. It's, you know, your job to shoot something. And, but I prefer it when it's just candid, just people, they don't even know I'm there, sort of fly on the wall. And then I can just find the moment to, I like to be unseen. I don't like to walk in there like the photographer, you know. And then I just like to be very quiet, and when it looks right, I just take the picture, you know. So, thank you for asking. Yes, ma'am?
Is there anybody that you haven't photographed that you would like to photograph?
Anybody I haven't photographed that I'd like to photograph? Well, it's too late now, but John Lennon, yes. I never shot the Beatles, never took photos of the Beatles, but in later years I took pictures of Ringo, as you saw, and George Harrison, and Paul quite a bit. But I never did take a photograph of John Lennon. I would like to have. I guess then the other people I would like to have photographed, I used to, before I got into folk music, I loved jazz. I loved starting out with Louis Armstrong and Bix Beiderbecke and the old jazz guys and Benny Goodman, you know, and then I loved West Coast jazz, was just Chet Baker and Jerry Mulligan, and my favorite jazz musician is Paul Desmond, who played the saxophone with Brubeck. And I never photographed those guys. It was long before I even was a musician, let alone a photographer. You know, I was going to be, when I graduated out of high school in Great Neck, Long Island, I was going to be a forest ranger. I was going to go to, yeah, I was all enrolled at the University of Montana to be a forest ranger. And that summer, I had my dorm room and everything, and I'd never been there, but my mom said, well, your father's been assigned to Bonn, Germany, so you can either go to Montana or come to Europe with us. And I thought, well, I can always go back to Montana. I'll go to Europe for a while and see what that's like. And so that was the road not taken. I went to Europe, went to college there, got into music, classical music. A guy with a guitar was playing folk music. I mean, it just changed my life to be there. And so then I became a musician, which I hadn't planned on, and then I became a photographer, which I also hadn't planned on, you know. Oh, and in between, I was majoring in psychology in college. So I could have been any of those things, but I just let life sort of, you know, sweep me along, and this is what happened, you know. And so nowadays, I still take photographs, not these same people. Usually when I photograph groups, I get a phone call and some group says, oh, you know, someone gave me your name, we've got a tape and no photos. And I always say, sure, I'll take photos. Because actually these people that I photographed were not famous, many of them, when I photographed them. I mean, I did the first Eagles cover, the first CSN cover, the first Jackson Browne cover. And so they hadn't even had albums out yet. They were not really that well known. And so today, to be doing the same thing is to be shooting groups that are unknown. And being a musician, I'm very interested and fascinated in music and what people are doing. So I'll take pictures of pretty much anybody that asks me. Otherwise, I'm taking pictures of, like I said, you know, fire hydrants and toilets and stars and hearts and all of that. I mean, like here in New York, I mean, I walk down any block and I'll take 20 pictures of graffiti and then whatever's going on. I just shoot everything I see, you know. Yes, sir?
How did your musical background help you photograph musicians?
Oh, how did my musical background help me photograph musicians? Well, for one thing, it put me in touch with all these musicians because they were friends of mine, you know. So they didn't see me as a photographer, and in fact, I mean, I wasn't really. I was a musician with a camera. It was my hobby, and so a lot of the early pictures were just they didn't perceive me as a photographer. There weren't a lot of photographers around then. There really weren't any rock and roll photographers. There were kind of old guys like the Monkees. When the first day I went on the set and made friends with them, they wanted me to come back the next day. They wanted me to come back every day because previously they had these old professional guys like AP photographers, and they'd say, "Boys, do something zany, you know, for the camera." And they hated that, you know. But I was, you know, a kindred spirit, and I was just along to have fun, and I would take photos when it was happening. I wouldn't tell them to do anything. So that was one way that it really helped me to be a musician. Also, musicians know how to hang out, because a lot of the life of a musician is hanging out. I mean, you think, you know, you really only work a couple hours in the evening unless you're recording or rehearsing. So musicians sleep late. They have the whole afternoon off pretty much, and then also on buses and airports and dressing rooms and clubs, you're hanging out. There's a lot of downtime. And I think some photographers, I mean, they're thinking about getting the picture, they kind of walk in and, you know, they take the picture right away. For instance, one time a record company wanted me to shoot the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and so they said, go backstage, go in their dressing room, take some pictures. Well, I had carte blanche to do all of that. I didn't really know them very well, and I walked in the dressing room, and see, I could have walked in and said, okay, you know, I'm here to take the photos and stand over there. I mean, I could have done that, but instead I walked in and I just sat down on the couch like this, and you know, they all looked at me, and then after about 5 minutes, they were all doing whatever they were doing, and then I could take the camera out and take pictures of what was really happening. Sometimes I say, I think of myself as the Jane Goodall of rock photography. She's a fantastic lady, and I love her and support everything she does, and she'd probably hate to hear me say that, but the way that she would take notes when the chimps were, you know, reacting with each other, and she wouldn't want to influence that in any way. She wanted to see what really was happening. Same with me. I don't want to influence what these people are doing in their dressing room or wherever, and so I wait quietly so I can take a good picture of what's happening. Yes, sir?
Henry, it seems like some of the secret of your success is this wonderful casual access, and it seems that what I hear a lot about record companies today and photographers who have to work with them, it's very restricted, limited access, and limited time.
Right. Yeah, the question is, you said that my pictures look casual. The casual feeling in the pictures, and nowadays it's much more restrictive. And that's true, that did happen. As I said, back in the 60s, there really weren't many photographers. When I shot Jim Morrison at the Hollywood Bowl, I didn't see another photographer. Later I've heard there was another guy, but I didn't even see him in front of the stage. Now, can you imagine if the Doors and Jim played somewhere, there would be, you know, 200, 500 photographers all wanting to get in there. So what happened is more and more photographers started showing up. It became popular. And then some of them were a little unscrupulous, and they would, you know, photograph and then use the photos for posters or things that were merchandising uses that the group had not agreed to. And so they started restricting that and saying you had to sign a contract that said you only use the photos for what you were hired for, and you could only shoot 3 numbers. Well, that's no good to shoot 3 numbers. I mean, the fun is just starting, you're just getting warmed up, and the good pictures happen later.
They give you the worst light.
Huh?
They give you the worst light in the first.
Yeah, usually, yeah, the worst light in the first few numbers, and nothing's really going. You know, they're not warmed up. It's not really the fun part. So, you know, in the 80s and 90s when I did lots of concerts, I would only do it if I was working for the band and I had an all-access pass. And even then, you know, the main thing, you know, people ask about bummers, you know, what kind of bummers. It was always the security guards, because you'd have an all-access pass, you'd be working for the band, maybe on the road with them. You'd walk out there and some big security guy would say, "No photos," you know. And you say, "No, man, look, I'm, you know, see here, I'm working for the band. I was told no photos at all." You know, and then you have to say, "Okay, come on, let's find the supervisor," and you got to do that whole dance, you know, for 5 minutes. But I only like to shoot if I can shoot the whole show. And you know, also, it distracts the performers, especially someone like Neil Young. He hates to look down and see all these guys, you know, shooting, because it blows the mood for him. And a lot of photographers now, when you can only shoot 3 songs, I mean, they get right up on the stage, they put their film boxes on the stage, and they're leaning there, you know, all pushing each other to get that shot, and it's very distracting. When I shot, I would always crouch down, squat down on the floor very quietly, have a telephoto lens, and just frame the guy from the waist up or the guitar up, and just wait, you know, just wait. Just like same thing I did on the Monkey set, you know. I just sit there and watch somebody's face and just wait till they turned around and smiled or said, laughed, and then click. So I spent a lot of time just looking, you know, just waiting for that moment,
So you
you know.
have to worry about handlers, press people, that kind of stuff.
I didn't have to worry. The question is, did I have to worry about handlers and press people? No, not really. It wasn't that sophisticated. There were really not big PR things, you know. It had not grown. I mean, think about the music business now is so huge and so diversified, you know. There's hip hop and heavy metal and, you know, rock and roll and country. It's all, back in the 60s, it was all just music on the radio, you know. It was, you just hear the Beach Boys and the Byrds and the Buffalo Springfield, and you know, they didn't have all those categories of music, and they didn't have all those handlers. And usually I worked for the groups anyway. I really worked for the groups. I didn't work for record. I mean, occasionally I'd get hired by a record company. Occasionally a magazine would call me, but that wasn't what I did. Mostly I just worked for my friends and the management. Yes, sir?
So, as I was mentioning earlier, I work in concert photography with
Yes.
musicians, and I've noticed, I'd say when I take pictures, I try to play with the lighting and make it more artistic.
Uh-huh.
But I've noticed a lot of photographers and pictures that get published are kind of losing that artistic essence. I'd say they're more of just taking 20,000 pictures and, you know, even
Right.
if they're blurry, you just publish them. What do you
Yeah.
think about that? You know,
Wow.
Has photography lost that essence of art? Or
Uh-huh. So the question is that my friend here shoots concerts, and he says he likes to try to get the real artistic lighting and stuff, but nowadays it seems like people just shoot hundreds of pictures and just use them. There's no,
even if they don't really have a good,
even if they don't have a
they're
good shot.
blurry, bad
Yeah,
lighting,
yeah.
and-
Well, you know, nowadays it's easier to take a lot of pictures with digital, you know. You could just, I mean, you know, back then it was 36 pictures, and then you'd have to stop and rewind and reload and everything. Now you can just shoot hundreds and hundreds without stopping. And you can look and see what you got, too. So that doesn't really answer the question. I don't know. You know, I think, again, it's that thing where you can really, a lot of times, only shoot 3 songs. So people are just rabid, you know, to shoot as many as they can. A lot of times newspapers and magazines especially, they just say 3 songs and that's it. So they're trying to get every picture they can take in 3 songs. But like I said, when I try to shoot a group, I usually am working for the group so that I can shoot the whole concert. And then I do wait for those moments. As I said, I sit there just looking and waiting until the guy does something, you know, like that Nirvana picture. I mean, I just wait for that moment and then take it. Yeah, I don't know. I can't
I
really.
think 3 songs is, from what I've done, because I do some press and
Yeah.
some directly with musicians.
Right.
3 songs is enough to get good shots.
Yeah.
If they don't give you good lighting, then it's a different
Right.
story. Or
So
if
you
they give you red lighting, you do black and white, and you know you
Right.
have to play with that. But I think it's a lot of them just go and shoot like crazy, and then some
Right.
publications just need one good picture. You know.
Well, that's right. Yeah, like he's saying, yeah, the 3 songs can be enough, you know, and especially if you shoot, you know, hundreds of pictures, and like you said, you know, they're really it's only one picture. Usually, it's just one picture you need. If it's a newspaper, they're only going to show one picture. A magazine, something like that. Yes, sir.
Henry, you ever do any darkroom work yourself, or do you go to lab?
Darkroom. Did I ever do any darkroom work? No, I never developed a roll of film in my life. I didn't know how, you know. And besides, But the first year or two, I only shot color. I mean, all I cared about was color slides. All I cared about was slideshows. I just wanted to show slides to my friends. So I shot, you know, Kodak slide film. I didn't even shoot Kodachrome. I shot Ektachrome X, Ektachrome 64. And then later years I used Ektachrome 200. I didn't use Kodachrome because at the end of the day it would make the pictures kind of reddish. And I didn't like that reddish hue. And then when I got asked, you know, later to shoot black and white, I mean, I had to shoot black and white, but I didn't really care about black and white. And the funny thing is, after, you know, 45 years of shooting, I realized, wow, I do have a lot of black and white. The funny thing happens after you shoot for 45 years. You know, you put all these things in boxes, and then about 10 years ago, people started saying, well, you must have quite an archive, you know, and I thought, archive? You know, I don't know. That sounds too professional to me, you know. So, but sure enough, you know, I have an archive and started really organizing it. And now I have an entire accidental business of licensing photos. You know, I shoot Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young every year when they play the Greek Theater. And for the past 20 years, 30 years, no one has ever wanted to use any of those pictures. They only want the stuff from '69, you know, and '70. So what was my point was that so I have this huge archive, and I get calls all the time from you know, magazines and newspapers, videos. Especially something happens after a long time, they start doing box sets. Like right now, Rhino Records is doing a box set on Stephen Stills. It's going to have 4 discs and a whole booklet, and I think I've got 20 or 30 pictures being used in that booklet. So it's best of albums and box sets that happen 20 years later, 30 years later. So all of these pictures that I took long ago, they're supporting me. You know, I also have an agency, Corbis, sells a certain number of my pictures, but I do a whole lot of it myself. And that really entails scanning. I mean, people say, quick, you know, show us everything you have on, you know, James Taylor, and then I have somebody that scans for me, and we send them low res, and they pick out the ones they want, and then we send them high res. And so I have the archive, but what was the question?
No, you answered it. Did you work in the darkroom?
Oh, did I work in a darkroom? I always figured if I'm going to shoot pictures all day, I don't want to be in a darkroom all night. Then would I sleep, you know, or have fun? So, although taking pictures was having fun. But in any event, I didn't know how to do that anyway. I never went to photo school. I never learned developing, printing, lighting. So I never used lights or a studio and I'm glad, because instead of having a studio with lights and a backdrop and having everybody come there, they would have looked kind of the same, and there wouldn't have been any stories, you know. When Gary and I did album covers, we would think of an adventure to get the group out of town, away from their girlfriends, away from their telephones, their managers, so we could really have some fun. And that's when Gary would say, just shoot everything that happens. Film's the cheapest part. And we go to the desert with the Eagles and take peyote buttons and just, you know, just laugh and have a great time, you know, for a whole day and a night. And I would just shoot hundreds of photos. So since color, I mean, you couldn't develop your own color in those days anyway. Kodak had to do it. So I just never did learn how to do that stuff. You know, now I have a photo lab in LA that prints my stuff. Richard Photo in LA has printed all my pictures for 40 years.
How did you pick the title?
I'm sorry, 1 second. What's that?
How did you pick the title for your book?
Oh, she wants to know the title for this book. This book, the Japanese put out a book some years ago, kind of like this. And they said the title of the book is going to be, when you translate the Japanese word into English, Unpainted Faces. I thought, wow, that is so poetic, and it means natural. It's a way of translating, you know, when you translate the little Japanese things into English, it would say Unpainted Faces. But when the book came out, they called it Innocent Age. And I thought, you know, what happened to Unpainted Faces? So now years later, I've redone the book. We just printed this early this year at our gallery, and I finally called it Unpainted Faces. And then later this year, we're going to do another book of color that's going to be called Painted Faces. That'll be the companion to this book. Yes. Ma'am?
With all the talk of Laurel Canyon, and it sounds everyone
Yeah.
came in that one place.
Yeah, okay, yeah. She's just asking the question about Laurel Canyon. Must have been a fantastic place. How did everybody end up in that one place? Yeah, you know, Laurel Canyon is just 5 minutes up the hill from Hollywood, from Sunset Strip and Hollywood Boulevard and all the record companies and clubs. 5 minutes up the hill and you're out in the country. It's kind of a rare thing. You don't have to drive a half an hour or hour to get there. It's right up the hill. And it was a place where lots of movie stars in the 30s and 40s had little summer cabins. And then musicians kind of moved in there because they could afford it, and you know, they needed little places. They didn't need a big house. So there's lots of little tiny cabins and things up there, and it just filled up with musicians. And nowadays, yeah, it has a mystique to it. There's been videos and two or three books about, one is called Legends of the Canyon. There's another book several books on Laurel Canyon. And when you go up there and look to see this fabulous place, all you see is a street going up with cars parked on one side and little houses back off the road. You know, you don't see anything. You don't see musicians. You don't see, in the 60s, sometimes you'd see girls, you know, with flowers in their hair and tie-dyes walking down the hill. You might stop and give them a ride, but there weren't crowds of people around. Everybody actually went down to the Troubadour Club, and that's where everybody hung out. Then they go up to their little private places, you know. Occasionally on a weekend, you would hear, you know, a guitar echoing from across the valley or something. More often, you would hear coyotes at night, or you hear a dog barking, or owls hooting, you know, that kind of a thing. There were possums and raccoons. I mean, there still are up there. It's a very quiet place out in the country, and it just was so handy for musicians to live up there, and they still do live up there. There's still a whole new generation of musicians that live up there, and some of the old generation as well. Well, okay,
Thank you all for coming.
I guess it's the end of the deal, but listen, I've got books here if anyone wants to buy them or wants to talk. I'm here. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
For more information, please visit us online, give us a call, or stop by our New York City Superstore. You can also connect with us on the web.